Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to again be with you here today. I obviously want to acknowledge Leighton and Lynn and thank them for the opportunity to be here. Plan for me this afternoon is just to roll through, I guess, a bit of a high-level overview of some of the things that we're looking at and thinking about at ISQ, and then hopefully at the end we'll have some time for questions as well. So if there is anything that you do want to follow up on or any questions that you might have, please feel free to fire them at me. So I thought I'd start off, as we normally do, with a little bit of a sector snapshot, just to give a sense of what we're seeing across the independent school landscape in Queensland, some of the trends and issues that are keeping us focused at the moment as well. So I know many of you will be well and truly aware of a lot of this information, but we think it's always worthwhile to reinforce who we are and what we look like as a sector. So roughly 230 schools, 235 I think now this year, with an additional sort of 44 campuses on top of that. You know, one of the things that I think coming into this role the board talked to me about was the diversity of our school set, and I think you really do see that in terms of the various different types and sizes of schools that we have. So, you know, nearly 40% of our schools under 200 students and very broadly spread. And similarly in the profile and the different types of our schools, so 80% or so of our schools have a religious affiliation, and around 60% of them in the major cities in southeast Queensland here, and about 40% sitting regionally. And this slide is a little bit busy, but what it intends to show you is some of the trends that we've really, or the trends that we've really seen over the last 20 years, which is increased growth and market share across the independent sector here in Queensland. So currently about 16.3% of students in Queensland attend an independent school, and that's up from 12.5% in 2000, and that trend has been fairly consistent and continuing over that entire period of time. And again, when we're talking to government, we do like to talk a lot about the different types of students and families that are part of school communities across the independent sector. So, you know, over 6,000 Indigenous students, 1,000 overseas students, and I think very importantly for our sector, playing such a significant part in boarding, over 3,000 boarding students across the sector as well. And finally on that piece of snapshot, so you know, roughly 20,000 people work across the independent school sector in the teaching and non-teaching roles, and as you can see there, student to teacher ratios in the independent sector below the other two sectors as well. So this data and some of the data that I'll show you is based on sort of the end of 2022 data, but I guess one of the key messages that I'd like to get across today is that growth and that continued drive and point of difference in independent schools is causing parents to continue to want to send students to independent schools, and we're continuing to see that growth coming through with no signs of abating, despite the obvious challenges that we see out there around cost of living and a range of other things that might give you pause for thought around people's capacity to pay. So again, some of the headline trends. So as you all know, I wasn't in the sector coming into that COVID period, but as I understand it, there was a lot of angst and concern around what that period might bring in terms of student growth in enrolment numbers coming into the sector. And of course, what we have actually seen is strong and sustained growth coming into independent schools coming through the pandemic. And as I say, with very little sign of that slowing. This is probably one of the more interesting slides that gives us pause to think about what's going on and driving a lot of that growth in terms of enrolments across independent schools. So you can see here, the green line is the growth rate for independent schools in Queensland, the red line is the growth rate for Catholic schools, and the blue for state schools. This isn't a uniquely Queensland phenomenon. If you had the similar slide up for most of the states across Australia, you would see a very similar type of outcome. So it's not just about population growth in southeast Queensland driving enrolment growth in independent schools. There's a more significant underlying shift that's gone on through COVID that's given families pause to think more deeply perhaps about what they want to see in terms of education for their children. And I've got no doubt, unfortunately I wasn't here for Mark, but I've heard him speak before about that alignment of values being a significant component and contributor to thinking around that growth as well. But as I say, one of the things we do like to keep an eye on is population growth, births, deaths and other things to give us a sense of what the future might look like for our sector. And as you can see here, we are fortunate to be here in Queensland where there is very strong population growth, which is obviously going to continue to drive demand and quite possibly continue to create capacity constraints across a number of our schools as well. Now, I've just realised looking at this next slide that I forgot to put the key on it, so it doesn't make a lot of sense unless I explain it. So the light blue bar is natural increases of population, so births minus deaths. The dark blue bar is interstate migration, so shows whether a state has had positive or negative interstate migration. And the orange bar has been international migration over the past 12 months. And if you go left to right, the furthest to the left there is New South Wales, Victoria. So you can see a significant decline in the number of locals living in Victoria and a high level of interstate migrants leaving Victoria. Second across is New South Wales, and then third is Queensland. So what's unique there, I think, is obviously we're picking up a large share of that interstate migration. But unusually for Queensland, we're actually picking up a high share of international migration as well. Historically, international migrants go to Sydney and Melbourne first and then find their way to somewhere else in the country, whereas what we're seeing is Queensland being a destination of first choice. I think the other thing that we're looking at and thinking about in terms of the new people coming to Queensland is, particularly for that interstate migrant, historically the decision to come to Queensland has been one based around cost of living. The classic story of being able to sell your house in New South Wales, put a few $100,000 in your pocket, move up to Queensland, have a bigger house and a better lifestyle. The type of interstate migrant seems different in this wave to what it did in that sort of early 2000s period. It's probably more white-collar employees, taking their job with them as they come up from down south, as opposed to coming up here and looking for a job, and probably have a higher capacity to pay for things like school fees, which we think as well is part of potentially what's driving some level of growth and interest in independent schools across the state. But in terms of one of the other things that I think is front and centre for a lot of us thinking about where we're at currently and what the next 6 to 12 months might look like as well. We're in an incredibly high inflation environment, higher than we've been for a long period of time, and that's driving wages growth and cost growth across every business sector and certainly across independent schools. And none of us are quite sure where that's going to take us and what that's going to look like moving forward. But some of these bigger macro trends that are sitting in behind that enrolment growth and a range of other things are certainly things that we're thinking about in terms of information and support that we should be providing schools over the next 6 to 12 months as we all seek to navigate this sort of different environment. So with that little bit of, broader economic background, I thought I might touch on just 3 issues that keep coming up as top of mind issues as we get out and about across schools. There are certainly many more, but I thought I'd talk a little bit about fees, what we've seen this year and potentially what people need to contemplate moving into next year. Building and construction, the need versus risk that's being taken on there. And we've heard a lot about student and staff wellbeing, but I think we're starting to hear more about the wellbeing of the leaders across our schools as well. So I'll touch a little bit on that. As I say, there's many other issues, AI, workforce and a range of other things that we know that are top of mind, but I thought for today I'd just touch on these. So this slide captures what we saw in school fee changes coming into this year. So an average increase of around about 5.5% across Queensland, obviously varying from different school to school, and those schools more significantly impacted by DMI had a more significant increase. Again, probably not totally inconsistent with what we saw around the country as well, but certainly very different to what has been the case over the last decade or so, where the predictability of a 2 to 3% price increase for all of us in most of the things that we were encountering in our life was very much part of how we lived. We're building a solid relationship with the folk at EdStart, who have some really interesting data around what's happening with families and school fees, and I just thought I'd touch on this to give you a sense of the feedback that they got from families that operate with them. So whilst that average fee increase was about 5.5%, when schools implemented that towards the end of last year, most families were thinking about 3%. So that sort of historic rate of fee growth, I'd suggest, is what they were thinking about, with a very small percentage of parents actually thinking that fees would be above 5%. So there was an element of surprise and discomfort, I'd suppose, about that level of increase. Although having said that, obviously didn't translate into any change of enrolments. More than 60% of families are reporting cutbacks in various areas of spending, dining out, holidays, and I'll show another slide in a second that speaks a bit to that. But only 11% were thinking about school arrangements as a result of some of the cost of living pressures that are going on. And one other point that I think is important for us all to be conscious of in this particular environment is people don't like to talk about their financial distress and the challenges that they're going through. So for every family in one of our schools that we might know of that's having a difficult time, there's probably at least one other family that's in a similar boat that might be struggling as well. Here we have just boarding fee change trends as well across the country, just for information, but I probably won't dwell on that. But this slide here is probably the one that speaks to that cost of living decision-making process that families are going through. So this is data that's collected by the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. So they, I think, touch something like 50% of financial transactions in Australia. It's either your credit card, an EFTPOS machine that you've tapped on, or it's going into someone else's bank account after you've spent the money, and so they see what it is, where it's gone. And what this shows is it's a report that they produce every couple of months, which looks at what households are actually spending their money on and the decisions that they're making. And so, as you can see there, in recent years, families have valued and continue to value investing in education as part of their household spending intentions. But what you can see on that slide is clearly a decision to pull back on things like entertainment, travel, and other discretionary things, health and fitness. School costs are sitting more with the non-discretionary items like utilities, motor vehicles and others as a need to spend item, not a discretionary item, which I think is an important thing for us to think about. I think over the last 12 months, a number of people have spoken to us and sort of asked the question, well, where's the tipping point? At what point does inflation and cost of living get so significant that we think that parents' intentions will change? And the answer to that is no one really knows. But we seem to think that it's probably more about employment than it is inflation when it comes to the decision making about school fees, school choice. If people feel confident that they've got a job, that their employment is secure, that this is seen as more as a non-discretionary item than a discretionary item. Moving on a little bit, I thought I'd talk a bit about buildings. So one of the challenges that clearly comes forward for a number of our schools accommodating all of this growth is the need to continue to build to enable that student population growth to come through, but also to revitalise facilities that are old and a range of other things. And it's clearly been a challenging environment to build anything over the last couple of years as well. So this is a piece of data stolen from the Australian Contractors Association. Through that last 2-year period, the big challenge was cost increases and escalation in material costs and delays because of shipping and things that occurred through COVID. And there's a sense that that's settling, but it is very unlikely from all reports that we'll see a slowdown in construction cost increase for this reason, which is that the pipeline of building work across Queensland is so much higher than it has historically been, and the industry doesn't actually have the capacity to step up and deliver more based on the number of people that they have. So again, this slide will tell a little bit more of the story, which is the number of unemployed persons per job vacancy in construction is at an historic low. So there just aren't the people out there to do the buildings and the building work and the construction work that would enable the industry to step up and do more. So the challenging and likely outcome there for all sectors, including ours, is a continued difficulty in predicting and sourcing construction and knowing what you're spending when you start the project and what it'll be by the time you finish it. We're doing a lot of work with our colleagues in the BGA to look at these issues and think about what we can do more to support schools, and there's a lot of refresh thinking coming out of the BGA around how to look at that in the future as well, so watch this space coming out of the BGA. But I guess, just to summarise that facilities and construction component, we're seeing that enrolment growth, there's that demand for new buildings, and there's this uncertain construction situation. We also see coming down the pipeline a greater focus on sustainability in the built environment in schools, which will probably add short-term costs to the construction as well, but potentially long-term benefit in terms of energy reduction and usage. And the other trend that we've seen through our What Parents Want survey is that parents increasingly take notice of the quality of the facilities at a school when making their decision around enrolment. That's increased significantly over the 15 years that we've undertaken that research. I'll just step on to one of the other areas that we're focusing in on at the moment, and one of my colleagues, Johannes, is in the room, and this is an area that Johannes has been involved in and thinking about. So this little grab here is from the most recent Education Ministers' communique. So they meet every month or 6 weeks or so and set an agenda in terms of what they want to do collaboratively across the different jurisdictions. And interestingly enough, for the first time, wellbeing of principals and school leaders has made it onto the Education Minister's agenda. So for a number of years, student wellbeing, staff wellbeing has been a high priority, but we're starting to see an increased focus on the wellbeing and the challenges associated with leading schools as well. And this is something that we've been thinking about at ISQ for the last few months, and again, stealing a bit of Johannes' glory here. One of the things that we did earlier this year was to undertake a principal survey, and about 78 of our principals responded. And I thought I'd just quickly step you through some of the results of that without giving too much away, as we're looking to do a little bit more on this over the coming months. So levels of satisfaction, I think, pleasingly reported by our principals were generally high. Generally speaking, satisfied or neutral with work-life balance. And I know Leighton's just come back from a number of weeks overseas, so I think he's feeling good about his work-life balance at the moment, so that's good news. We wanted to understand the challenges in a little bit more detail. So the challenges that seem to be creeping up the top more for senior leaders were the compliance components, the administrative tasks, the sort of endlessly increasing regulatory burden that seems to be coming through and the requirements associated with that. Lower down the list, interestingly enough, were things like parental expectations and accounting and budgeting for the future of the school. And again, some of the things that are probably more talked about publicly, like recruitment and the uncertainty through periods like COVID, again, rated less significant than some of those other challenges in terms of what school leaders are facing. And whilst it might be full on at times, that sense of needing to constantly communicate, again, not as significant as some of those more administrative and regulatory challenges that keep creeping up as well. We also asked principals what was it that they valued most from their board, and I won't sort of talk through that, and these slides will be available afterwards if you'd like this information, so don't feel too stressed about photos and things. But again, it's that communication and relationship between the leadership and the board that has come through as most important, that sense of partnership, I think, to deliver for the school community. We didn't ask all questions about how tough it is and how challenging it can be, so we also wanted to find out what were the things that motivated and inspired principals in their role. So some of the key themes that came through were clearly delivering positive outcomes for students, the great people that are across all of our schools, the opportunity to leave a legacy, and the positive change and the like that can be delivered by working in a school environment. But part of what drove us to start asking some of these questions was we've seen a high turnover of principals across our sector over the last 2 or 3 years, and that is concerning, as you'd all appreciate it. It's a significant reset for a school to go through a change of principal and senior leadership. So one of the things that we did ask was, intention to stay, I guess, is the classic way of describing this question. And I guess one of the concerning features is that, close to half of our principals intend to move on from their role within about 5 years, which would again sort of continue to see that level of accelerated turnover that perhaps might not be in the best interests all the time. So I'll come back a little bit later and talk about what we're thinking in terms of taking some of this work forward, but there's some of the bits of information data that we've been collecting. I thought I'd just touch a little bit on the advocacy work that we're doing federally, and obviously I want to acknowledge Alistair in the room as well and the work he's doing in this space. So at the Commonwealth level, there's a number of things that are high priorities for us in working with our national membership body, Independent Schools Australia. So you all would have seen the Teacher Workforce Action Plan that the Minister's released. There's a whole series of actions and activities that are coming out of that.